About 10 years ago, I was studying Dante in Florence, Italy, and I overheard some of my colleagues, other professors, talking about an eccentric woman who lived in a cemetery in Florence. And of course, my ears perked right up. And I went home that afternoon and grabbed my daughter and raced off to the cemetery. And I met Julia Bolton Holloway, and she is a hermit. She was a professor for many years here in the United States. She was a professor at Princeton, and then after that at the University of Colorado Boulder. And she retired to Florence, Italy, where she became a hermit and was invited to live in the gatehouse of the cemetery. It's called the English Cemetery in Florence. Over the centuries, the British have loved to vacation in Italy. They love the sunshine. And if you ever saw A Room with a View, that movie, that's just exactly what went on for years, doing the grand tour. The problem was that the British would die in Italy, and they needed to be buried immediately because it was hot. But they weren't Catholic, so they couldn't be buried within the city walls. So they made a special cemetery for them outside the city walls in Florence. And this cemetery is what Julia took on as a project and fixed up. She continued to do her scholarly work. She has done an enormous amount of writing, far more than I will ever do in my lifetime. She's done research on Dante, on Dante's teacher, Brunetto Latini, and for our interests, on an amazing female mystic from the Middle Ages in England named Julian of Norwich. So it might be a little bit confusing in my introduction here, where you need to keep straight the two amazing women, one of them who lived hundreds of years ago, Julian of Norwich, and then our speaker, Julia Bolton Holloway. So we got to keep those two straight. The other thing that is amazing, besides being a scholar, and she's going to speak to us today, Julia is going to speak to us about Julian. She lives an amazing life of service. One of the things that Julia does is to help take care of the Roma, the gypsies. They are EU citizens, and yet they are not allowed to work in Italy. And so, among other things, the Italian government takes their children from them, and Julia helps fight to get their children back for them. So just a few words about Julian of Norwich, who our expert here will be speaking to us about. A few months ago, I introduced you to Hildegard of Bingen from Germany. And this is a similar woman. She's a mystic. She's groundbreaking, just the fact that she's, having a platform at this time. I mean, women generally were not educated and did not have any way of teaching or spreading their knowledge at all. Julian of Norwich was also an anchoress. So she's, we talked about anchoresses and anchorites my last time when I spoke to you, but if you weren't here for that, an anchoress or an anchorite is someone who, in pursuit of their religious calling, they are walled into a room attached to a church. They hold a ceremony. It's almost like a wedding ceremony. It's kind of like a funeral too. And for the rest of their lives, they live in this room attached to the church. There's a window open into the sanctuary, and they live there. Why would they want to do this? Well, they wanted to do this in pursuit of a spiritual calling. Most of them were nuns first when they, before they became anchoresses. But, living in a convent wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. One of the medieval female mystics, I think it was Teresa of Avila, but I can't remember, she complains about all those gossiping nuns and how they are distracting her from God. Okay, so this is why people like this do this sort of thing. And Julian of Norwich gives us the first surviving English language works. by a woman. So that's pretty amazing. So if you've ever heard of the phrase, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, we get that from Julian of Norwich. I realized that, back when I spoke to you about Hildegard of Bingen, and today when we're talking about Julian of Norwich, we are talking about overtly Christian people who are going to talk about God, and they're referring to God as a he, and we have to be kind of patient with this, right? I mean, some of us may hate that. We may not resonate with that at all, right? Try to think about religion as a language. It's what we use to sort of point toward and grasp toward whatever that absolute is, whatever that divine is, that we can't put into language any other way. And a woman living in the Middle Ages isn't going to have any other language available to her besides Christianity, right? And so I always encourage my students to look for what we have in common with these people. What is she saying that's right? She may not be saying it in a way that we would ever want to say it, but it still can teach us about spirituality. So we begin our talk. Julia is going to give the talk for us. Fortunately, she's the expert compared to me on Julian of Norwich. But I am going to begin with a reading from Julian of Norwich's book called Revelations of Divine Love. And then we are going to play some music that is set to those famous words of Julian of Norwich, all shall be well. So if you're ever looking for this is from her Revelations of Divine Love from chapter 5. She says, at the same time, our Lord showed me a spiritual vision of his familiar love. I saw that for us, he is everything that we find good and comforting. He is our clothing, wrapping us for love, embracing and enclosing us for tender love, so that he can never leave us, being himself everything that is good for us as I understand it. In this vision, he also showed a little thing the size of a hazelnut in the palm of my hand, and it was as round as a ball. I looked at it with my mind's eye and thought, what can this be? And the answer came to me, it is all that is made. I wondered how it could last, for it was so small, I thought that it might suddenly disappear. And the answer in my mind was, it lasts. And will last forever because God loves it. And everything exists in the same way by the love of God. In this little thing, I saw three properties. The first is that God made it. The second is that God loves it. The third is that God cares for it. But what the maker, the carer, and the lover really is to me, I cannot tell. For until I become one substance with him, I can never have complete rest or true happiness. That is to say, until I am so bound to him that there is no created thing between my God and me. So when I spoke to you last time, I introduced you the term mysticism, being a mystic. And then afterwards, a few weeks afterwards, Linda had led us into a service talking about feeling at one with nature in camp experiences. That is what mysticism is. It is that sense of oneness with the absolute, however you define that absolute, whether it's, the earth itself or the divine. Okay. So now I'd like to turn it over to my friend and mentor, Julia Bolton Holloway.
We're going to begin with the music of All Shall Be Well, and I hope you can hear it. And we can go to the next slide. I'll just keep saying next to change the slide. And the next one. And this is where the manuscript is in red, saying, all shall be well, and thou shalt see it thyself, that all manner of things shall be well. It's her male editor who uses the Latin word revelation. She likes the Anglo-Saxon word. showing of love. And I use that as the title when I publish her. I've been publishing editions of her. She also says Jesus is her mother. She feminizes God. And I've actually run into an Anglican priest who says she's a heretic for saying that. And in this talk, and we can go to the next slide, I've defined it here. This is, I think we've got to the end instead of the beginning. Let's see. Right, the next slide. Oh, when we don't have the slides correctly presented. And okay, I think you need to go all the way back to the beginning. And I'm going to mention first about paleography. Can you go to the next slide? And the next one. Yes. That's not the correct slide. I don't know what's happened. They've got mixed up. So we'll have to sort of improvise. And I've been studying the manuscripts she wrote and realizing that she actually had to do it as a kind of samizdat publication, a secret publication that was preserved by women because the men, including the monks, kept trying to prevent it being published. Try the next slide and see what we've got. Right. This one is where you will see the hazelnut in the palm of her hand. This is the Paris manuscript, which was written by nuns who had to go into exile because they were Catholics and England had become Protestant and would burn them at the stake if they returned. So they did return in disguise because they wanted to publish this text and have it printed. But it was too dangerous. And one of them was imprisoned, another died. But they did everything to save this text. And go to the next slide. Right. That one is the text manuscript I discovered wrapped up in brown paper at the back of a safe at Westminster Cathedral. And I got into trouble in the Church of England for it because they actually went and plagiarized it and gave it to a male scholar to publish. Fortunately, my colleague had already published my transcription and citing me for it. The next slide. Right. That is the Amherst manuscript, which was also preserved by these Catholic families in hiding who had to pay huge taxes and so forth if they because of their Catholicism. But it's a lovely text, and it says that it's being written in 1413, at which point, as because of her Lollard teaching, she speaks of her even Christians, everyone is the same. It's not a hierarchy. She could be burned at the stake for saying that. And also that icon of Julian was painted for me by an Orthodox monk. And it's absolutely right because it shows her as a Benedictine nun. She's contemplating Mary, contemplating on Jesus in her womb. And so we contemplating her are contemplating in a kind of Chinese boxes, Russian dolls, having God within us. And this is very daring for a woman to say, to be using her own gynecological obstetrical body for saying that. And next slide. Right. This is where she talks about St. Cecilia, who very daringly says to the Roman authorities that she will not sacrifice to the pagan gods, for which she's burned in a bath and goes on preaching after her head has been cut off even. And Julian, spiritual director, is Adam Easton, a Norwich Benedictine, whose titular church in Rome is St. Cecilia's Church in Trastevere. And Julian is being like St. Cecilia in preaching, even at the risk of death. And next slide. Right, these are the corrections, possibly in her own hand, where the other scribe, the male writing it down, and he's the only male scribe of all of these manuscripts, has skipped a line, so she puts it back in. And next slide. And we continue with those eye skips. Next slide. Next one. Right, this is a manuscript I found in Norwich Castle. It's not the Showing of Love, but it's where texts she puts together, including Pelagius. He was the heretic who said there is no original sin, which I believe is correct. Its original sin is not in the gospel. It's something that Augustine came up with. And she also has a treatise on the Lord's Prayer, and she keeps speaking in words which are straight out of the Showing of Love. I think she has written it. Next slide. The next one. Okay, continue with that and go on. This is all from the Norwich Castle manuscript. Continue. And continue, right, continue. And again. And also this compilation in the Amherst manuscript is possibly for another anchoress, Emma Stapleton, whose father is mentioned in Chaucer's Knight, who goes on the same battles as Alexandria and so forth. And he has this contemplative text, Seeing Christ. It's the same vision that Julian had. Next slide. Right. That is the Westminster manuscript. And continue. Right. And then what happens, these were manuscripts written by the nuns of Zion Abbey. And then there was a problem because an Elizabethan pirate went to the abbey, which was in exile now in Lisbon in Portugal, pretended to be converted by the monks and nuns, and was even ordained, and then fled with the convent's treasures and wrote a libelous book against them, which meant that the recusant families could no longer send their daughters there. So they founded another convent, this time in Cambrai, that was Benedictine, with the same descendants from Thomas More and so forth. And we have these manuscripts written out by those nuns. And continue, next slide. Right. I have been working with the idea of women writing books as a revolutionary act. Although back in the Old Testament it was the prophetess Huldah who told the Hebrews that they must study the Torah, which had been forgotten in the cupboard in the temple. And so there was a tradition of women, but it had to go underground. And when men were defending these women, they were citing Huldah as the reason why they should be allowed to preach and write. This is Hildegard of Bingen, the next slide. And this is Sant Umiltà. She was contemporary with Dante. I call my website Umiltà after her. And she's rather like my story. She was married. She then enters the convent and makes her husband vow chastity. Then she flees from her convent and becomes an anchoress. Then she comes to Florence and founds an order of the Vallombrosan monks. She's illiterate, but she can dictate wonderful theology. Next slide. And this is Christine de Pizan. She's more secular, but she writes this wonderful dream vision. She's having to support her children. Her husband has died. She's left widowed. And she writes these marvelous coffee table books about how to govern Europe with peace. And she gives them to kings and so forth. And this is the vision of her with her guide, the Sibyl, where she's rewriting Dante's Commedia as a feminist text. Next slide. And this is Birgitta of Sweden, who was doing the same, writing massive books of her visions, where Jesus and Mary tell her to tell popes and emperors to stop having their silly wars and make peace. And her work is wonderful. And Julian is copying her. But also another woman is copying her, named Marjorie Kemp, who comes to visit Julian in Norwich from Lynn. And Julian encourages her to go on pilgrimage, which Julian can't do. She's an anchoress. And Marjorie goes and copies all of Birgitta's pilgrimages to Jerusalem, to Compostela, and so forth. And I copied all of their pilgrimages. And I didn't walk all the way to Compostela. I took the train. But it was marvelous having that experience, including climbing Mount Sinai. Next slide. Yes, this is where the painting by, I got into trouble for this book, Equally in God's Image, Women in the Middle Ages. The men who wanted to block women from priesting were really angry about it. But the photo on the cover is from the Madonna by Donatello, where she's holding her prayer book at the moment the angel comes to her. Telling her she's now pregnant. And this painting here is by Antonio Damascena, where he's painted an Arab girl in Sicily at her prayer desk at the moment that the angel, come to her, telling her she is about to have a child. Next slide. And those are the books I publish in limited editions and so forth. Next slide. I'm sorry, you seem to be using an older version of my talk with the slides and so forth, and so we don't have the rest. But what I found wonderful was that these women, with great courage, kept preserving her text. It took a long time before anyone could get it actually in print. One of their spiritual directors, Serenus Cressy, in 1640, Julian is writing it back in the 14th century. It really went underground and was preserved in these abbeys. And the risk that they took was burning at the stake, being hung, drawn, and quartered. Elizabeth Barton, who copied Julian, was executed in this very barbaric way, and by Henry VIII, because she was saying he shouldn't be divorcing his wife. And also, they went into exile, and there had already been Marguerite Porete burned at the stake in 1310. You either could have a male patron who protected you, or you were at great risk for doing theology as a woman. Finally, the French Revolution came, and the abbey, the Benedictine abbey, where the nuns were preserving these manuscripts, hastily writing them out so that they wouldn't be lost, and even establishing a daughter monastery because the monks wanted to call them in and destroy them. And then the French Revolution came. The nuns were imprisoned with the Carmelites at Compiègne, who went to the guillotine. And the jailer gave the nuns the clothing of the dead Carmelite nuns, and they were finally able to come back to England with their manuscripts. At one point, only one manuscript was left in England, two, with the Norwich Castle and the Amherst. There's still one in Paris, but all of the others have now come back. And now they're being published, and people are talking about them and using them and so forth. And I find that these manuscripts, these texts, are a great consolation for especially women. Also, Julian's own life, she was possibly Jewish in Norwich, which had a large Jewish community, and 96 of them converted to Christianity rather than being exiled. And Julian is translating directly from the Hebrew, 2 centuries before the King James Bible. She's a brilliant woman, and her theology is outstanding, but it did need to be hidden away for such a long time, lost as was Boulder with the Torah in a cupboard, concealed, and so on. So I thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about her. I've been finding that even I get persecuted for expounding her theology by certain parties, but it's worthwhile doing because what she says is so healing. She's against hierarchy. She's against original sin. There is that of God in everyone. God's word is in everything. Therefore, it will not be destroyed. There is a great secret, she says, at the end of time, possibly where time will go backwards and all sin be undone. So let me end with that. And if you have comments, I would love to hear them.
Do we have anybody in the congregation that wanted to ask a question? It's sort of thrilling to be able to cross such distances and be able to talk with someone who is, you know, in Italy right now as we speak. Yes.
Julia, what did what drew you to study this particular mystic?
Well, actually, I resisted Julian for a long time. I was before women's lib, and I had this sense that women are no good, that men are so excellent over women because that had been instilled in me. And then Sir Richard Southern was teaching a seminar at Berkeley, and he was having us work with women and Jews. And he was teaching me how to respect myself. And then a colleague asked me to work on Birgitta of Sweden because she did the pilgrimages, and I had written a book about men doing pilgrimages. So then in turn, I did a study of all of her manuscripts across Europe. And I kept finding the connections through her to Julian. And then I discovered this manuscript, which had been lost in a safe, wrapped up in brown paper. And I wanted to do my thesis for the Lambeth in England. And that's when I got into real trouble. I entered my convent to do it in her context of prayer. And the next thing I found was that the bishops threw us all out. And I had to flee to Italy. But I was continuing to edit Julian in the face of having lost everything. I was living for 4 years in one unheated room, but the Italians published it, and it's a huge volume that we published, and I'm very grateful that they did, because it's a text. I was so lost after what the bishops did, but every time I turned to a page of her text, my faith came back, especially the sense of the gospel is not about hierarchies. It's the opposite. It's not about Pharisees and money. It's about all of the outsiders. And that is the sense I got from Julian. Does that answer that question?
Hi, Julia, this is Nancy.
Yes.
Thank you so much for coming to us today. I did want to ask you, well, first of all, I want to tell you that probably half of us wish that we were living there in Italy with you, given what's going on here in the United States.
I know, yeah.
I wanted to ask you, how should we regard Julian's words, that all shall be well, when it seems like we live in a time in which things are not well?
Right. Well, actually, Julian is taking that from the Old Testament, where Elisha has promised a woman who doesn't have a child that she will have a child. And he dies at 12 years old. He says, I hid my head, and he falls and he's dead. And the servant of Elisha comes and she says, and all shall be well, and all shall be well. Shalom, which is a totalizing. And it's very sarcastic. And then Elisha comes and lays himself on the child's dead body, and he's resurrected. And so Julian's words are not sentimental. They are about when you've lost everything, as I had, editing her. And in the end, it works out. I ended up living like Julian in a graveyard. And I've been able to write many more books. My latest is The Bible and Women, Miriam and Mary, where I talk about the need to get rid of hierarchies. And Cardinal Timothy Radcliffe has says it's a brave book. And that's in the face of the Vatican and so forth. So I think things will eventually be all right, as even with this talk, where to begin with, we were having a lot of trouble electronically, and we solved it.
I think we have time for one more question, and then
It's not a question so much as an expression of gratitude for the intense commitment you've had in bringing this work forward and sharing it with all of us. I think in times like these, it is so important that we remember that we are not the first ones to resist systems of oppression, and that this has been ongoing for a very long time, and that these historical figures can be guides and mentors to us. So recovering this work is really very precious, and I thank you.
Right. And you can actually find the talk with the right slides on YouTube. If you go to Julia Holloway on YouTube, and then Unitarian Julian, you'll find it. So we've got a more permanent version of this talk that we gave this evening. And thank you for this opportunity.